Intro. He told her she wasn't even worth the price of an Uber ride, but at the next table, someone else was watching, and to him, she was worth everything. It begins on an ordinary night. A restaurant filled with soft music, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle hum of conversation. To most people, it was just another weeknight. But for her, for Haley, it was a night she had quietly built her hope around. She had dressed in a pearl-colored gown that wasn't new, but precious. It once belonged to her mother. And though the seams were a little frayed, she wore it like armor. She had saved $5, just enough to cover tea if she had to. Just enough to prove to herself that she could show up, even when the odds said she shouldn't. Haley had agreed to a blind date after months of hesitation. And tonight, she walked into that restaurant not because she trusted easily, but because a part of her still wanted to believe that maybe love could arrive like a candle flame in the dark. But the world can be cruel to those who hope. Minutes passed, her phone buzzed, and with just a handful of careless words, a stranger crushed the fragile expectation she had carried in her heart. "You thought I was really coming? Not worth the Uber." What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that someone had already noticed. A man at the next table. A man who understood loneliness, who had tasted grief, who was about to change the meaning of that night forever. This is not just a story about rejection. It's a story about being seen when you least expect it. About dignity being restored in the smallest, simplest acts. And if you've ever been left waiting, if you've ever been told you weren't worth the effort, this story is for you. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more untold stories of love, loss, and the quiet ways we heal. Because sometimes, the ones who change us aren't the ones we chase, but the ones who choose to stay. Section 1. The Arrival. Haley stood at the entrance of the restaurant, her hand brushing against the smooth pearl-colored fabric of her dress. It wasn't new, it wasn't expensive, but it carried her mother's memory. And tonight, it was the only armor she had. She smoothed the sides nervously, as if pressing wrinkles could also press down the anxiety rising in her chest. The bell above the door chimed a little too loudly when she stepped inside. And she froze for half a second, feeling as though the entire room had turned to look. Of course, no one really did. Couples leaned close over candlelight. Friends laughed over wine glasses. Waiters weaved between tables with practiced grace. Still, in her mind, every clink of silverware seemed to echo her arrival. Her heels clicked softly as she followed the hostess. The air was warm with the scent of roasted garlic and baked bread. She tried to breathe it in, tried to let it calm her nerves, but all she could think about was the $5 bill folded neatly inside her purse, her safety net. Her backup plan. Enough for tea, maybe, not enough for dignity if the night went wrong. The hostess led her to a small table by the window. A single candle flickered in its holder, casting long shadows across navy linens. The glow felt almost too romantic, too hopeful, like it was mocking her. Haley sat carefully, crossing her legs beneath the table, clutching her purse in her lap like it was part of her. She glanced once at the clock on the wall, 6:45. She was early, 15 minutes early, to be exact. Good. It gave her time to steady her breathing, to rehearse the smile she'd practiced in the mirror, to remind herself that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. From her seat, she scanned the entrance again and again. Each time the door swung open, her heart jolted. Each time it wasn't him. She tried to look casual, tried to sip her water as if she wasn't keeping count. But deep down, she knew she was waiting for more than just a date. She was waiting for proof that hope wasn't foolish, that love wasn't something reserved only for people with more than $5 in their purse. And though she didn't realize it yet, someone else had already noticed the way she walked in, with hope in her eyes. And fear pressed tightly behind her smile. Section 2. The wait. Haley sat at the small table by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She tried to look calm, but her fingers tapped lightly against the fabric of her purse. The candle between the plates flickered with every draft of the door, as if it too was waiting with her. She checked the time again. 6:50. Still early. She reminded herself that being early was a good thing. It gave her space to breathe, to gather her thoughts. She took a sip of water, forcing herself to pretend she wasn't already rehearsing her first words. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her head lifted. Maybe that was him. Maybe that was Aaron, the man she had exchanged weeks of gentle messages with. His words had been kind, measured, never demanding. She clung to that hope. Each new arrival pulled at her chest, first a couple with their arms linked, then a group of co-workers laughing too loudly, then a family herding two children toward a back booth. Not him, not yet. Minutes stretched like hours. At 7 o'clock, she shifted in her chair, uncrossing and crossing her legs again. She smiled faintly at the server who poured more water into her glass. The room was alive with laughter and conversation, but at her table, silence pressed heavy, like a weight no one else could see. She picked up her phone. No new messages. She scrolled back through the last one. Can't wait to see you tonight. Just reading it made her chest ache. But she smiled anyway, holding onto the promise hidden in those words. At 7:10, she glanced at the door again. Her smile grew thin, trembling at the edges. She pulled her hair behind her ear, adjusted her dress, and reminded herself to wait just a little longer. People get delayed. Traffic happens. She told herself all the reasons someone might be late, clinging to each excuse like a fragile thread of hope. By 7:15, her phone buzzed in her palm. She opened it quickly, her pulse racing, only to realize it wasn't him. It was a notification from the weather app. She laughed softly, bitterly, at her own reaction. Her laughter dissolved into silence. The longer she sat, the louder the world around her became. The scrape of forks on plates, the muted clink of glasses, the occasional bursts of laughter. They weren't sounds of joy to her, they were reminders. Reminders that every other table was filled, that every other person had someone across from them. Everyone but her. Section 3. The cruel text. At 7:20, Haley's phone lit up on the table. Her pulse jumped as she reached for it, hope flaring so quickly it almost hurt. She unlocked the screen, expecting an apology, maybe a message saying, "Running late, be there soon." Instead, the words cut through her like glass. "Wow, you actually went. I was just messing with you. Sorry, but you're not really my type. Not worth the Uber." For a moment, the world around her blurred. The soft glow of candles, the clinking glasses, the laughter, all of it collapsed into a dull, hollow ringing in her ears. She read the message again, as if a second glance might change the words. But they didn't change. They never do. Another buzz. A second message appeared. "You seem nice, but seriously, you thought I was actually coming?" Her throat tightened. She forced her eyes up, blinking fast, refusing to let tears fall here. Not in this place. Not in front of strangers who didn't know her name. Her fingers curled around the napkin in her lap, gripping it so tightly it nearly tore. The cruelty wasn't just in the rejection, it was in the casualness of it. The thoughtless, almost playful tone, as if humiliating her was nothing more than a joke. To him, she was just a face on a screen, a disposable story he'd never think of again. But to her, it was one more reminder of how fragile hope could be. She swallowed hard, setting the phone face down on the table. Her body felt too stiff, her smile too heavy. Around her, couples leaned close, waiters balanced trays. The world went on, yet at her small table by the window, time seemed to stop, pressing her into silence. Haley straightened her spine, the only act of dignity she could cling to. She would not cry here. She would not let him take that from her. But inside, Her chest ached with a familiar question, the one she never spoke aloud. Was she ever going to be enough for anyone to show up? And though she couldn't know it yet, someone else had seen it all. A man at the next table, watching not with pity, but with recognition, because once, long ago, he had been the one left waiting too. Section 4. The Watcher. Ethan Blake had planned on nothing more than a quiet dinner that evening. A long meeting earlier had drained him, and he sat in his charcoal gray suit, a glass of scotch resting in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He wasn't looking for conversation. He wasn't looking for anyone at all. But then she walked in. The girl in the pearl-colored dress, smoothing the fabric nervously, her eyes darting to the door with a mix of hope and fear. Ethan noticed in a way he hadn't noticed anyone in a long time. Not because of her beauty, though she carried a quiet kind of grace, but because something in her expression stirred an echo in him, something he thought he had buried. From his seat, he could see her table clearly. At first, it was small details that caught his attention, the way she sat upright, trying to appear composed even when her fingers betrayed her with constant fidgeting. The way she checked her phone, then set it down as if pretending it didn't matter, only to pick it up again minutes later. The way her smile faltered each time the door opened and it wasn't the person she was waiting for. He remembered that feeling, the waiting, the slow, creeping dread that maybe you weren't worth the effort of someone else's time. Years ago, he had felt it too, not in a restaurant, but in life, waiting for love to stay when it always seemed to slip away. And when her phone lit up and her face drained of color, Ethan didn't need to see the words to know what had happened. He saw the way she stiffened, the way she blinked too quickly, fighting against the sting in her eyes. He saw her shoulders lift, spine straightening as if dignity itself was the only shield she had left. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition. He knew that silent battle, the war to hold yourself together while the world reminded you how alone you were. So Ethan sat there, watching quietly, his scotch forgotten. He told himself he wasn't going to interfere. She was a stranger. Her story wasn't his. And yet, his gaze never left her table. Because something in him refused to look away from the girl who still sat waiting. Long after the waiting was over. Section 5. The meal that wasn't ordered. Haley reached for her coat, ready to slip away quietly before anyone noticed. Her body felt heavier than it should. Her steps rehearsed in her mind. Stand. Smile faintly. Walk out as if nothing had happened. Maybe if she moved fast enough, no one would see the humiliation etched across her face. But just as she rose from her chair, a server appeared at her side, holding a steaming plate of pasta and a tall glass of sparkling lemonade. The aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air, so rich it made her stomach ache. "Excuse me, miss," the server said kindly, setting the plate down in front of her. "Your order." Haley blinked in confusion. I didn't order this. It's been taken care of." The server explained. "Someone requested it for you. Your tab has already been covered." Her brows furrowed, suspicion tightening in her chest. Was this another cruel trick? Another stranger laughing at her expense? For a second, she thought about refusing it, about leaving anyway, but before she could, a calm voice broke through the noise of the restaurant. "It's not charity," Ethan said, his tone low, steady. He stood a few feet behind her, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. "It's a reminder. You deserve to eat, even if the world tries to tell you otherwise." Haley turned, startled. His gaze wasn't sharp or pitying. It held something else, something quieter. Honesty, recognition, as if he had seen every tremor in her hand, every second of hope collapsing, and decided not to let her walk away unseen. She sat back down slowly, her pulse racing. The steam from the pasta rose like an invitation, but her hands stayed locked in her lap. No one had ever done something like this for her before, without agenda. without expectation. For the first time that night, Haley felt the smallest crack of warmth push through the cold weight in her chest. Someone had noticed. Someone had chosen to remind her she wasn't invisible. Section 6 honest words across the table. Ethan didn't wait for her permission. He simply pulled out the chair across from Haley and sat down. His movements steady, unhurried, as if he belonged there all along. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clatter of dishes and bursts of laughter from other tables filled the silence between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was suspended, like the world had shifted slightly. Giving them room, Haley stared at the plate in front of her, the steam curling upward like fragile ribbons of hope. She hadn't lifted her fork. Her hands were still locked together in her lap. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," Ethan replied. His gaze was calm, direct, but never sharp. "But sometimes doing what we don't have to do matters most." She glanced at him, unsure. He looked expensive, the tailored suit, the understated watch, the kind of man she would never expect to sit across from her voluntarily. And yet, there he was, watching her with an expression that wasn't pity, wasn't judgment, but something she couldn't quite name. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. His voice lowered, steady, deliberate. "Take care of your stomach before you try taking care of someone else's heart." Haley's breath caught. Of all the things he could have said, flattery, charm, even awkward small talk, this was none of them. It was simple, almost ordinary, and yet it pierced straight through her defenses. Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not dismissing her, not mocking her, but reminding her of something she had long forgotten, her own worth. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached for the fork. She twirled a strand of pasta, lifted it, tasted it, warm, real, the first proper meal she'd had in days. Ethan leaned back, giving her space, as if that single bite was more important than any words he could say. And in that moment, Haley understood. This man wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to remind her that she deserved to be seen, to be fed, to exist without apology. Section 7 The Cafe Encounter. A week passed before Haley saw him again. She had convinced herself that the dinner was just a fleeting moment, an unexpected kindness from a stranger she would never meet twice. Life had quickly pulled her back into routine, classes, long hours at the library, late-night shifts at the clinic. On a Thursday morning, she ducked into a small cafe wedged between the bookstore and the college library. It wasn't a place she could often afford, usually. She stopped only for black coffee and the free Wi-Fi. Today, she fumbled with her worn coin purse at the counter, debating whether to skip the milk to save a few cents. "Make that too," a voice behind her said. Smooth, calm, familiar. Haley turned, startled, and there he was, Ethan Blake, sleeves rolled up, laptop open on a corner table, as if he belonged to the cafe itself. His expression carried the same calm steadiness she remembered, the kind that didn't need to demand attention, because it already held it. "You remembered my name," she said softly when he handed her the cup the barista had placed on the counter. "I remembered your courage," he replied simply. The name was the easy part. The words landed heavier than she expected. Courage? She had felt anything but brave that night. And yet here he was, naming something in her she hadn't been able to see herself. They sat together in the corner, sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting golden lines across the wooden table. The cafe buzzed with quiet chatter, the smell of cinnamon and roasted beans warm in the air. Their conversation unfolded easily, about coffee preferences, about failed ad campaigns at his company, about the absurd meme that went viral when one slogan accidentally made it sound like they were promoting baby chewing gum. Haley laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a long while. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was light, genuine. spilling out before she could stop it. And Ethan didn't rush to fill the silence after. He didn't press, didn't pry, he just sat there, sipping his coffee, listening like her words carried weight. For once, Haley didn't feel like she had to explain herself. She was just heard. When she finally stood to leave, she expected him to ask for her number, to suggest dinner, to anchor her to some kind of promise. But he didn't. He just smiled, nodded, and let her go. And strangely, that quiet respect, that absence of demand, stayed with her longer than any promise could have. Section 8. The child WHO remembered. Haley hadn't expected to see him again so soon. She pushed open the glass door of the library, clutching a small stack of borrowed textbooks, her mind still swimming with medical terms she needed to memorize. The library was her safe place, quiet, tucked away from the noise of campus life. But as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. Near the children's reading corner stood Ethan. His tall frame was slightly hunched as he bent down to adjust the collar of a little girl in a yellow sweater dress. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Her tiny hand gripped his finger with natural trust. And when she peeked shyly from behind his legs, Haley realized immediately, this was his daughter. Ethan noticed her then. His expression softened, almost apologetic, as if caught between two worlds colliding. "Hey," he said quietly. "Didn't expect to run into you here." Haley managed a small smile. "I was just returning books." Her gaze flicked toward the child, who was now staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. "This is Lily," Ethan said gently. "She's a little shy at first." Haley crouched slightly, lowering herself to the child's level. "Hi, Lily." For a moment, the little girl hesitated, her lips pursed in thought. Then she stepped closer and tugged lightly at the hem of Haley's cardigan. In a small, certain voice, she whispered, "She smells like mommy." The air shifted instantly. Ethan's shoulders stiffened, his hand tightened protectively on Lily's small arm. His jaw clenched as though holding back something heavy. Unspoken, Haley's heart thudded. She hadn't meant to intrude, hadn't expected to step into a space still raw with memory. She knelt carefully, her voice gentle. "That's a big compliment, Lily. Your mommy must have smelled like kindness." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if confirming a truth only she could sense. Ethan looked away, blinking fast, his throat working to steady itself. "She passed 2 years ago," he said finally, voice roughened by the weight of memory. "Lily doesn't usually say things like that." Haley swallowed hard. She wanted to say the right thing, but no perfect words existed. Instead, she just met his eyes. For the first time, his gaze wasn't guarded or composed, it was open, unshielded, carrying grief and something else. Something that looked dangerously like hope. Section 9. Healing through small acts. It didn't happen all at once. Healing rarely does. It crept in quietly, disguised as small moments that no one else might notice. Haley began stopping by Ethan's office now and then, not because he asked, but because she somehow belonged there. Sometimes she'd drop off annotated notes from his research on toddler nutrition, catching errors even seasoned consultants had overlooked. Other times, she'd linger in the corner, sipping tea while he rehearsed slides for an upcoming pitch. She never tried to impress, she simply cared. And that made her presence more valuable than any contract Ethan had ever signed. And then there was Lily. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Ethan's nanny had class or unexpected emergencies, Haley would step in. It started with small tasks, picking Lily up from daycare, braiding her hair before bed, reading just one story. But one story always became two. Two became three. Soon, Lily refused to sleep without Haley's gentle voice weaving through the pages. Ethan noticed. He noticed how Lily's laughter came easier around Haley, how tantrums melted into calm with just a touch of her hand. He noticed how his own late-night work didn't feel so crushing when Haley sat at the kitchen counter. quietly highlighting textbooks while soup simmered on the stove. None of it was grand. No confessions, no sweeping gestures, just quiet consistency. A meal placed on the table before Ethan realized he was hungry. A gentle hand on Lily's forehead when a fever flared. A text that read, "Don't forget to breathe today." And with every small act, the sharp edges of grief dulled. The walls Ethan had built so carefully didn't come crashing down, they softened. Brick by brick, replaced with something sturdier, trust. Haley didn't heal him with declarations. She healed him with presence. And in return, without meaning to, Ethan gave her something she hadn't felt in years, a place where she didn't have to fight to belong. She simply did. Section 10, letting go, without losing. The letter came in a plain envelope. Haley held it in trembling hands, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear. She tore it open, and the words leapt out at her: full scholarship. 1-year pediatric specialization, Oregon. It was everything she had dreamed of, everything she had worked toward when the nights were long and the future felt too far away. But joy didn't come first. What came was a heaviness in her chest. Because it meant leaving. Leaving Lily's bedtime stories. Leaving the quiet evenings in Ethan's kitchen. Leaving the fragile rhythm of something that felt like home. She waited 3 days before telling him. They sat on a park bench while Lily chased bubbles across the grass. Haley pulled the folded letter from her pocket, her voice barely steady. "I got it. The scholarship. It starts in August." Ethan's eyes widened, his smile immediate. "Haley, that's incredible." Her gaze stayed on the ground. "It's in Oregon. A whole year." The wind carried fallen leaves around their feet. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Ethan spoke, his voice steady but soft. "You should go." Her head snapped up. "You think so? You earned it," he said simply. "But what if?" Her throat tightened. "What if you think I'm just leaving? Like I used you for stability, and now I'm walking away?" Ethan shook his head slowly, his expression gentler than she'd ever seen it. Loving someone doesn't mean holding them down. It means not clipping their wings. The words sank deep, cutting through the fear she hadn't admitted even to herself. For the first time, Haley realized love wasn't about chaining herself to someone out of fear of being left behind. It was about being trusted enough to fly. When she boarded that plane in August, tears blurred her vision, but they weren't tears of loss. They were tears of knowing that what they had built wouldn't vanish with distance. Because letting go, she understood now, didn't always mean losing. Sometimes, it was the purest way of keeping. Outro. Some stories don't end with fireworks. They don't end with a kiss in the rain, or sweeping violins playing in the background. Some stories end quietly, like a candle that burns steady instead of exploding into sparks. Haley and Ethan's story was never about grand gestures. It was about showing up when no one else did. About a plate of pasta delivered to a table where a girl sat alone. About a child who remembered love not with her head, but with her heart. About the courage to let someone go, not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough to want their wings unbroken. And maybe that's what makes this story linger. Because it isn't fantasy, it's a reminder that love doesn't always arrive with promises carved in stone. Sometimes, it arrives in the quiet things, in respect, in presence, in small acts that whisper louder than words. So tonight, as you sit here listening, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in Haley's shoes, waiting for someone who never showed up? Only to discover that kindness came from somewhere you didn't expect? Or maybe you've been Ethan, watching from across the room, recognizing in someone else the very ache you once carried. Share your story in the comments, because your words might be the reminder someone else needs tonight. And if this story moved you, if it stirred something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Every story we tell is for those who still believe that love in its truest form, isn't about saving or being saved, it's about being seen. So stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that changes everything for you.